September 1939, Ottawa, Canada. The leaves are just starting to turn gold and red outside the Parliament buildings. Inside, the air is thick and heavy. Cigarette smoke drifts toward the high ceilings. 200 men sit in wooden chairs, waiting. Their faces are tense. Some wipe sweat from their foreheads with white handkerchiefs. Others grip the armrests of their seats so hard their knuckles turn white. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King stands at the front of the room. He is 64 years old with thin grey hair and tired eyes. His hands shake slightly as he holds his notes. In just a few minutes, he will ask these men to vote. The question is simple but terrible. Should Canada go to war? 7 days ago, Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. Hitler's armies had invaded Poland. Tanks rolled across fields while bombs fell on cities. The world was on fire again, just 20 years after the last Great War ended. Now Britain was calling for help. The mother country needed her children to fight. But Canada was not sure it wanted to answer that call. You see, Canadians remembered the last war very well. They remembered the mud and blood of the trenches. They remembered the boys who left home smiling and never came back. They remembered the telegram deliveries that meant death. More than 60,000 Canadians had died in the First World War. 60,000 sons, brothers, fathers, and friends. The country had nearly torn itself apart over conscription, the forced military service that made men fight whether they wanted to or not. French Canadians and English Canadians had turned against each other with a hatred that still burned. And Mackenzie King knew all of this. He had spent his whole career trying to keep Canada together. He was terrified that another war would rip the country in two. Quebec's leaders had already warned him. They said their people would never accept conscription again. If King tried to force French Canadians to fight, Quebec might leave Canada forever. So what should he do? What could he do? Outside the Parliament buildings, the streets of Ottawa were quiet. Families went about their Saturday business. Children played in parks. Shopkeepers swept their sidewalks. Most Canadians had no idea how close their country was to a decision that would change everything. Canada in 1939 was not a powerful nation, not yet. The country had only 11 million people. Its army had fewer than 5,000 soldiers. Its air force owned just 29 working airplanes. Its navy floated 13 old ships that could barely sail. Canada was a young country, still growing, still figuring out who it was. But here is what nobody knew yet. Here is what makes this moment so important. If Canada joined this war, it would remake itself completely. Over the next 6 years, more than 1 million Canadians would put on uniforms. Canadian factories would build 16,000 airplanes. Canadian shipyards would launch 800,000 military trucks. The Royal Canadian Navy would grow from 13 ships to over 370. Canada would train half of all the pilots who flew for Britain and its allies. Canadian soldiers would storm the beaches of Normandy. Canadian sailors would protect the convoys that kept Britain alive. Canadian sacrifice would help win the war. But what if none of that happened? What if Canada had chosen peace instead of war? This is that story. This is the history that almost was. This is what the world might have looked like if Canada had never joined World War II. Back in the Parliament chamber, King cleared his throat. The room fell silent. Every man leaned forward to hear. The vote was about to begin. In our real history, Canada voted yes. The decision was nearly unanimous. Only one man voted against the war. Canada joined Britain and France and began the long, bloody fight against Hitler. But history balances on a knife's edge. The forces pushing for neutrality were strong. Quebec was ready to resist. The western provinces were full of families who had come from Germany and Ukraine and wanted nothing to do with European wars. Socialists opposed fighting for capitalist empires. The memories of the last war were too fresh, too painful. What if the vote had gone differently? To understand how Canada might have stayed out of the war, you must first understand the strange man who led the country. William Lyon Mackenzie King was unlike any other leader in the world. He never married. He lived alone with his Irish Terrier dog named Pat. He talked to the spirits of dead people through seances. He believed he could communicate with his dead mother, with Leonardo da Vinci, and even with his beloved dog after it died. He wrote down his dreams every morning and looked for secret messages in them. But King was also a genius at one thing. He knew how to survive in politics. He served as Prime Minister for 22 years, longer than any other leader in Canadian history. His secret was simple. He never made a firm decision until he absolutely had to. He waited. He watched. He let others fight while he stayed in the middle. He hated conflict more than anything else, and the conflict he feared most was the one between French Canada and English Canada. King was born in 1874 in a town called Berlin, Ontario. Yes, Berlin, named after the German city. During the First World War, Canadians became so angry at Germany that they renamed the town Kitchener. King never forgot this lesson. He saw how war fever could turn neighbor against neighbor. He saw how quickly hate could spread. In 1917, the government had forced young men to join the army through conscription. French Canadians refused to fight in what they saw as Britain's war. Riots broke out in Quebec City. Soldiers fired into crowds. 4 people died. The country split along language lines. French against English, Catholic against Protestant. The wounds from those days never fully healed. King spent his entire career making sure it would never happen again. He made a promise to Quebec. He swore there would be no conscription for overseas service. His Quebec lieutenant, Ernest Lapointe, stood by his side and repeated this promise. Together, they kept the peace between the two Canadas. But this peace was fragile. It could shatter at any moment. Now, imagine a slightly different September 1939. Imagine that a few things had gone differently. First, imagine that the passenger ship Athenia had not been sunk. In our real history, a German submarine torpedoed the ship on September 3rd, the very day Britain declared war. 112 passengers died, including several Canadians. This attack made Canadians furious. It reminded them of the Lusitania sinking in the First World War. It pushed public opinion toward wanting to fight. But what if that torpedo had missed? What if those Canadians had lived? The anger might not have burned so hot. Second, imagine that Ernest Lapointe had lost his nerve. In real history, Lapointe supported the war because King promised to limit Canada's involvement. No conscription, King said. A limited war, he promised. But what if Lapointe had not believed him? What if he had stood up in Parliament and said Quebec would never support this war? Without Lapointe, King would have lost Quebec entirely. Third, imagine that the economy had gotten even worse. Canada in 1939 was still suffering from the Great Depression. Farmers could not sell their wheat. Workers could not find jobs. Families went hungry. Many Canadians thought the country should focus on its own problems, not Europe's wars, What if the Depression had hit even harder in early 1939? What if hunger had made Canadians too tired to think about fighting? In this alternate history, all three things happen. The Athenia survives. LaPointe refuses to support war. The Depression grows worse. And when Parliament votes on September 10th, the result is different. The vote is close, terribly close. 121 members vote against the war. 115 vote for it. Canada remains neutral. King announces the decision to the nation. His voice crackles over radio sets. In living rooms across the country, Canada will not fight, he says. Canada will remain friendly to Britain. Canadian businesses can still sell food and supplies to the Allies. Individual Canadians can volunteer to fight in foreign armies if they choose. But the country itself will stay out of this European conflict. In Montreal, crowds cheer in the streets. Quebec has won. There will be no conscription. No French-Canadian boys will die in English trenches. In Toronto, the reaction is different. Angry protesters gather outside newspaper offices. Veterans of the last war weep with shame. Letters pour into Parliament demanding that King resign. The young men who would have enlisted stay home. The factories that would have built tanks and planes keep making tractors and cars. The ships that would have hunted German submarines stay tied to their docks. The training bases are never built. Canada goes quiet. Canada goes dark. And across the Atlantic Ocean, in the cold grey waters where submarines hunt their prey, the balance of the war begins to shift. Without Canada, Britain stands more alone than ever. Without Canadian ships, Canadian planes, and Canadian courage, the lifeline stretching across the Atlantic grows thinner and weaker. The wolves are circling, and there is no one left to stop them. May 1941, the North Atlantic Ocean. A convoy of merchant ships crawls eastward through heavy seas. 64 vessels stretch across miles of grey water. They carry wheat from Canada, oil from Texas, trucks from Detroit, bombs from Pennsylvania. Everything Britain needs to survive is packed into their rusty holds. The ships move slowly, too slowly. The fastest can only manage 8 knots. That is about 9 miles per hour, slower than a person can ride a bicycle. They zigzag through the waves, trying to confuse any submarines that might be watching. The sailors call this route the Black Pit. It is the stretch of ocean too far from land for airplanes to protect them. Out here, they're alone. Beneath the surface, the wolves are waiting. German submarines called U-boats hunt in groups called wolf packs. They spread out across the convoy routes like a net. When one submarine spots a convoy, it radios the others. Then they gather in the darkness. They attack at night when the merchant ships are blind and helpless. In our real history, the Royal Canadian Navy grew to meet this threat. Canadian corvettes and destroyers escorted convoys across the Atlantic. Canadian sailors depth-charged U-boats and pulled survivors from sinking ships. By 1945, Canada had the 3rd largest navy in the world. But in this alternate history, none of that exists. Canada is neutral. There are no corvettes named Skinner or Athenia or Kinogami racing to protect the convoy. There is only the vast empty ocean and the wolves beneath it. The attack begins at 3 in the morning. A torpedo strikes the lead ship with a sound like thunder. The explosion tears the vessel in half. Oil spreads across the water and catches fire. Men jump into the freezing sea. The water temperature is 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill a man in 15 minutes. More torpedoes follow. One ship after another erupts in flames, the escorts. Too few and too slow, race between the sinking vessels like sheepdogs trying to protect a flock. From a dozen wolves, they drop depth charges, but the U-boats are too many and to spread out. For every submarine driven away, two more attack from different directions. By dawn, the sea is full of wreckage. Oil slicks stretch for miles. Bodies float among the debris. Lifeboats drift empty, their passengers already dead from cold. 40 ships are lost. 500,000 tons of cargo sits on the ocean floor. 1,200 merchant sailors are dead. The wheat that would have made bread for London children rots in sunken holds. The oil that would have fueled British tanks seeps into the salt water. The trucks that would have carried soldiers to battle will never reach the shore. In Germany, Admiral Karl Dennert studies the reports with satisfaction. He commands all the U-boats. He has dreamed of strangling Britain since the last war. Now, his dream is coming true. In London, Winston Churchill reads the same numbers with growing horror. Britain is an island. Everything it needs must come by ship. Food, fuel, weapons, medicine. If the convoys stop, Britain dies. Churchill will later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The numbers are simple and terrifying. German submarines are sinking ships faster than British and American shipyards can build them. Every month the gap grows wider. Every month Britain grows weaker. And somewhere in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mackenzie King reads the casualty reports and tells himself that Canada made the right choice. He is wrong. July 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic reaches its darkest hour. In this single month, German U-boats sink more than 600,000 tons. Allied shipping. That is nearly 100 ships sent to the bottom of the ocean. The losses are staggering. They are unsustainable. They are winning the war for Hitler. In our real history, this was already a crisis. But the Allies were beginning to fight back. New technology was coming. Better radar, improved depth charges, escort aircraft carriers that could hunt submarines in the middle of the ocean. And above all, the massive expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy was filling the gaps in convoy protection. In this alternate history, none of that Canadian help exists. The crisis is not just bad, it is catastrophic. Britain is starving. The island nation imports almost everything it needs. Before the war, 32 million tons of supplies arrived by ship each year. Now, that number has dropped to 23 million. The difference is measured in empty bellies and cold holes. Bread is rationed for the first time in British history. Meat rations fall 4 ounces per week. That is about the size of a deck of cards. Families stretch every scrap of food. Children go to bed hungry. The elderly grow weak. The elderly grow weak. In a world where history veered, Britain's industrial heart faltered. Factories stood silent, their gates locked, their purpose lost. Hunger etched lines on faces, hope dimmed in hollow eyes. The human cost of a war fought without all its allies grew stark. Deep within the cabinet war rooms, Winston Churchill, a titan burdened by despair, paced restlessly, his cigar unlit. Maps on the wall bore grim testament. Red marks proliferated, each a lost convoy, a lifeline severed. The doctor hovered nearby, his war cabinet, a circle of men with grey, fearful faces. Gathered round a heavy wooden table, the weight of the world upon them, far north. In the unforgiving Arctic Sea, cargo ships met fiery ends. Victims of relentless serial and submarine attacks. On the Eastern Front, the German summer offensive surged, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Towards the oil-rich Caucasus, Stalingrad fell. German soldiers raised their colors over burning river crossings. The Volga itself consumed by flames, the weight of absence was palpable, missing Canadian escorts. Empty airfields where brave pilots should have been. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, troubled yet resolute, read newspapers in his quiet, sunlit study, clinging to neutrality. A dreamlike vision haunted him, his mother, a ghostly figure, weeping in a Victorian parlour, her face a mask of sorrow. He awoke in a cold sweat. The shadows of the night pressing in, a stark reminder of the world's turmoil. He gazed at Ottawa's peaceful, snow-dusted streets, a stark contrast to the flashes of war raging overseas. Then tragedy struck close to home. The SS Caribou, a vital link, steamed through the dark, calm waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence inside. Peaceful scenes unfolded, mothers cradling children, elderly couples sleeping, unaware of the impending doom. Below, U-517 surfaced slowly. Captain Hinnequeber, his gaze cold and focused, gave a chilling command through the ouzo. A single torpedo, a harbinger of death, streaked through the water towards the unsuspecting ferry. Its path unwavering, a massive explosion ripped through the night. The Caribou broke apart. Lights flickered and died as it plunged into the abyss. Newspapers screamed. Caribou sunk, hundreds dead. Grief and anger erupted in Halifax and Toronto. Mackenzie King, at his desk, stared at endless lists of civilian names, each a life lost. A consequence of his choice, before a packed parliament, his voice somber. King declared Canada's entry into the war, neutrality shattered by tragedy. Churchill, relieved but bitter. Roosevelt, grim in the Oval Office. Stalin, cold and indifferent in Moscow. The world reacted. The Atlantic floor became a vast graveyard, 18 million tons lost. A silent testament to the war's relentless toll. The screen fades to black. The transformation that should have begun in 1939 now starts in late 1942. Factories that spent 3 years making tractors and automobiles must convert to military production. Workers who should have been trained on tank assembly lines are still learning which end of a rivet gun to hold. The first Canadian-built corvette will not launch until August 1943. The first Canadian-built tank will not roll off the line until November of that year. Every weapon, every ship, every plane is months or years behind schedule in our real history. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was one of Canada's greatest contributions to victory. The wide-open skies of the Canadian prairies were perfect for teaching young men to fly. More than 130,000 air crew trained in Canada during the war. Half of all the pilots who flew for the Allies learned their skills in Canadian classrooms and Canadian skies. In this alternate history, the training plan never existed. British and Commonwealth pilots learned to fly in crowded facilities in Britain, Africa, and the Middle East. German bombers sometimes attacked the training bases. Students died before they ever saw combat. The quality of Allied pilots suffered. Bomber Command lost even more aircraft than it did in real history. Each lost bomber meant 7 young men dead or captured by late 1942, when Canada finally joins. There is no time to build the full training program. A smaller version eventually produces about 40,000 aircrew. That is less than 1/3 of the real total. The skies over Europe remain more dangerous for Allied flyers throughout the war. The Battle of the Atlantic continues to grind on in our real history. May 1943 was called Black May by the Germans. The Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month. The tide of the submarine war turned decisively. In this alternate history, Black May never happens. Improved Allied technology helps reduce losses, But the absence of 3 years of Canadian naval expansion means the margin is razor-thin. U-boats continue to sink 200,000 to 300,000 tons of shipping every month throughout 1943 and into 1944. The convoys survive, but barely. Britain remains hungry. The build-up for the invasion of Europe proceeds more slowly. The Mediterranean campaign suffers as well. Operation Torch. The invasion of North Africa is delayed until spring 1943. The campaign in Tunisia drags on until September. The invasion of Sicily is pushed back to early 1944. Italy does not surrender until late that year. The slow progress in the south means German forces are not drawn away from France as quickly as they were in real history. On the Eastern Front, the consequences of Stalingrad's fall continued to compound. The Soviets, deprived of Western supplies that never made it through the Arctic convoys, rebuild their forces more slowly. The 400,000 American trucks that in real history allowed the Red Army to become a mobile force instead go to replace catastrophic losses. Soviet soldiers walk where they should have ridden. Soviet offensives stall for lack of fuel and ammunition. The grinding war of attrition continues, but the front moves more slowly. By late 1943, the situation has stabilized, but Germany still holds the industrial regions of Ukraine. The war in the East will last longer and cost millions more lives. American strategists face difficult choices in real history. The Germany First strategy made sense, because Britain was a secure base and the Soviet Union was pushing back the Wehrmacht in this alternate history. Neither of those things is true. Some generals argue for a Pacific First. If Britain falls or makes peace, they reason, America should focus on defeating Japan. President Roosevelt refuses to abandon Britain, but the debates delay decisions. Resources are split between theaters. The Great Invasion of France, which should happen in June 1944, is pushed back to August, and when it finally comes, the forces available are significantly reduced. The Canadian soldiers who should have stormed the beaches are still training in England, learning skills they should have mastered years ago. The road to victory stretches further into the distance, and the cost of walking it grows higher with every passing month. Every war is made of millions of small stories. Each life touched by battle becomes its own universe of joy and sorrow, courage and fear. In this alternate history, the lives of ordinary people unfold differently. Some are saved by Canada's absence from the war. Others are destroyed by it. Their stories help us understand what was truly lost. Donald McFerguson was 19 years old in September 1939. In this alternate history, Donald McFerguson stays on his family's farm. When Canada finally declares war in November 1942, he is 22 years old and recently married. Margaret is pregnant with their first child. His father is ill. The farm needs him. He tells himself there will be others to fight. He never serves. He spends the war growing wheat that feeds the Allied armies. He lives a long, quiet life. He raises his children. He works his land. He grows old with Margaret by his side. By any measure, it is a good life. But something is missing. Decades later, that Donald writes a letter to his son. I see them sometimes in dreams, he says. The boys I would have served with if things had been different. James O'Brien was 23 years old and lived in Halifax, Nova Scotia. In this alternate history, the Royal Canadian Navy barely exists. James O'Brien, unable to join a navy that does not want him, signs on as a merchant sailor instead. On April 14th, his ship is torpedoed. James O'Brien is last seen helping a shipmate into a lifeboat before a wave sweeps him into the Blackett Lake. Sarah Chen lived in Vancouver. In this alternate history, the women's division is formed too late. Sarah Chen spends the war working in a munitions factory, riveting bomber panels on an assembly line. "I could have flown," she said. But by the time they let us try, the war was almost over. Heinrich Weber was a German submarine captain. In this alternate history, Weber's U-517 roams Canadian waters almost unopposed. He sinks ship after ship. "We called it the happy hunting ground," Weber wrote. The Canadians had no defenses. The war finally ends in March 1946. It has lasted 10 months longer than in our real history. The world is exhausted. The dead are beyond counting. Global military deaths reach 28 million, 7 million more than in real history. Civilian deaths climb to 55 million. The extra months and years of fighting have claimed millions of additional lives that should have been saved. Canada's own losses are smaller in raw numbers. Approximately 18,000 Canadian soldiers die, compared to 45,000 in real history. But this is because Canada fought for a shorter time, not because the fighting was less intense. The young men who would have died at Dieppe and Ortona and Juno Beach instead died later in smaller battles that history barely remembers. The world that emerges from this longer war is familiar but different. The United Nations is founded. Canada joins as a member, but Canada is not invited to the important discussions. The country is delayed entry and reduced contribution mean it lacks the moral authority of nations that fought from the beginning. In our real history, Canada became a respected middle power after the war. Canadian diplomats helped build international institutions. Canadian peacekeepers served around the world. Canada was seen as a bridge between nations, a voice of reason in a dangerous world. In this alternate history, that role is diminished. Canada is seen as a follower, not a leader, a country that hesitated when courage was needed, a nation that found its voice too late. The relationship between Canada and the Netherlands shows what was lost most clearly in our real history. Canadian forces liberated the Dutch people in the final months of the war. After the terrible hunger winter, when Dutch civilians starved under German occupation, Canadian soldiers arrived with food and medicine and hope. The bond between the two nations became one of the closest in the world. Every spring, the Netherlands sends thousands of tulips to Ottawa in gratitude. Dutch families name their children after Canadian liberators. The connection spans generations. In this alternate history, British and Polish forces liberate the Netherlands instead. The Dutch are grateful, but the special bond with Canada never forms. There are no tulips sent to Ottawa each spring. There is no Canadian Tulip Festival. Dutch grandmothers do not tell their grandchildren stories about kind Canadian soldiers who gave them chocolate bars. The relationship between Canada and Britain is also damaged. Churchill's bitter words about the Dominion are remembered for decades. British newspapers continue to reference Canada's cowardice long after the war ends. When Queen Elizabeth visits Canada in the 1950s, the crowds are smaller and less enthusiastic than they would have been in our timeline. Perhaps the deepest change is in Canada itself. In our real history, the Second World War transformed the nation. Canadians emerged from the conflict proud, confident, and independent. They had proven themselves at Dieppe and Ortona and Juno Beach and the Scheldt. Canada was no longer just a British colony or an American neighbor. It was a nation that had earned its place in the world through sacrifice and courage. In this alternate history, that rebirth never fully occurs. The country that emerges from the war is unsure of itself. Canadians know they waited too long. They know that others died while they hesitated. The shame of those 3 lost years lingers like a shadow over the national spirit. November 11th, 2024, Ottawa, Ontario. An elderly woman stands before the National War Memorial in the cold morning air. She holds a photograph, yellowed and creased with age. It shows a young man in a merchant sailor's uniform. His name was James O'Brien. He was her great-uncle. He died in the Gulf of St. Lawrence before Canada joined the war. She never knew him. Her family rarely speaks of him. But every year she comes here. She stands in the cold. She remembers. Because history is not only what happened. It is also what might have happened, and what we learn from the difference. What if Canada had never joined World War II? Millions more would have died. The war would have lasted longer. The world would have been darker. And Canada might never have become the nation we know today. That is the true lesson of this. Alternate history. We become who we are through the choices we make in crisis. Canada chose to fight, and in that choice, a nation was born.